All right, good morning, everyone. Maybe good afternoon for some people. I see that we have people jumping onto the webinar as I speak, but we should get started. We have 1 hour. Welcome to WEConversations, our first edition for 2024. Great to have everyone with us. Today, we're just going to jump into it. We're looking at the European elections, parliamentary elections, and a change of commission coming up this year. The focus that we're going to look at as we move through this conversation is the Europe we want, building future-proof labor markets that work for all. So very much from the perspective of the HR services industry of the World Employment Confederation. But before we get into that, and specifically looking into our WEC manifesto, the Europe we want, we do need to look at the Europe that is and that we're experiencing today before these elections occur. Before we get there, I'd like to introduce our two guests. We have WEC-Europe President, Sonja van Lieshout. Welcome to the webinar. Welcome to the WEConversations. And Eleonora Vasques of EurActiv. And Eleonora is going to start us off today by setting the stage for what is happening across Europe and maybe trying to read the tea leaves a little bit when it comes to these elections. Eleonora, before you get started, I read this morning that at the Commission, they're holding a tribute today for Jacques Delors, one last goodbye to a visionary of the European Union who was hell-bent on making sure it did not decline. But as we walk towards these elections in June, there is that fear again and perhaps a great rightward shift. And even today, and dominating this week and the past week, are farmers' protests across France and Belgium, and you know that could threaten very much the stability moving forward with Europe. But I'm going to leave it to you to set that stage. So thank you very much and welcome.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and to talk about issues that I'm really passionate about. As Andrew said, I am a politics reporter here in Brussels, and I mainly cover the European Parliament and the European elections. Before starting to do some consideration about this election, it's important to know that at the European Parliament, the electoral law, it's not a real European electoral law. So the European countries will have 27 different electoral law. So this means that when voting, most of the dynamics and most of the rules will be at national level. And this has been a problem since in 1979, when there was the first European Parliament election. So since then, the electoral law was never changed. And since then, we have this, I would say, discontinuity between the Europe of 1979 and the Europe of nowadays, because the European landscape is more and more important on one hand. On the other hand, there is still a important presence of political power at national level, both in terms of electoral means and in terms of policy at the European Union institution. So there are minimum standards at the European level, like, for example, proportionality for the seats, the fact that there will be, specific number of seats for each member state that the parliament decide each legislative term. But then the competition will be a national level, like, for example, how to organize the list, if there are the preference or not, how the different part of the country is divided, if there, all of these issues are at national level. So we will see again a competition at national level. However, since 2018 election, in comparison with 2019 election, there are important, significant differences that we will see maybe will shape the electoral competition in a different way. And we well know that the difference is a global pandemic, a vaccination campaign at EU level, the war in Ukraine and its consequences, and any issues that at a European level that start to enter in the national narrative of different member states, including, for example, migration. So even though there are different dynamics, there are different cultures of political culture in the 27 member states. There are different issues that start to encounter the European landscape in terms of narrative. So everybody has talked about the pandemic and COVID in Europe when there was the vaccination campaign promoted by the EU. Everybody were talking about the reaction of the EU when the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine on February 2022. So these are elements that can shape the electoral competition in a different way, even though we are still in the 1979 electoral law. So this is an important thing to say. And then now I would like to just draw a little bit what we could expect for the next European Parliament. But first of all, we are in times where security, closing the border, and like anything that it's external scares the perception of the electorate. So we are in times where a narrative that tend to be far right, so tend to be, we have to be more secure, we have to protect ourselves, we have to protect our identity, in that specific far right sense that we see in different European countries. It's predominant, and it's a winning card to move votes, okay? I'm not assessing this as a good or bad thing. I'm just trying to be very objective on the fact that now it's more easily to move votes when it comes to security, rather than to see if we want to be inclusive, even though these are two narratives that will for sure compete, and we will see several surprises in the next European Parliament competition, which, by the way, will be between the 6th and the 9th of June, and all the results will be announced together on the 9th of June. This is actually the first time the elections are in June, usually are at the end of May, and that will complicate, from my point of view, the negotiation after the election on how to compose, for example, the political groups and anything that it's afterwards, that, for example, the nomination of the different position inside the European Parliament, but also the vote for the Commission President and the composition of the European Commission, which, by the way, it's kind of, from my point of view, in the hands of member states rather than the European Parliament. I mean, the commissioners. So it's important to say that there are some issues now that regard security, regard the protection or the perception. Okay, so we are talking about the perception, not real politics, because nowadays there is a big difference between the two that move votes. For example, one of the topics for sure, migration. So the idea of closing the borders to foreigners coming from a certain country, it's like moving votes. It's something that it goes in the media, it creates interest, it's clickbait, so it's used to move vote by not only far right parties, which, by the way, they are the ones that started since I would say a decade or more to have this narrative, but also from other more centrist groups. So they managed to make that narrative hegemonic, the far right, towards the other political parties on a different subject, on security. I mentioned migration because maybe it's the more the example more evident to everyone, and and this is very important when it comes to see the national dynamics of why people are voting in a certain way, like which are the sharper narrative that makes people feel more secure from a rhetoric point of view. Who is the leader, why it's working in that particular political culture, and why it can convince like the last in this, like people that, for example, they don't know what to vote, at the end they decide to vote based on a perception. And usually these people are the decisive voters for certain outcomes. And on that, I want to open a brief parenthesis on your issues, so anything related to employment, welfare state, and that I already actually talked about this with Andrew in our previous conversation. Most of the discontent is driven by unemployment, lack of access, like lack of, for example, access to different services because the state is not able to provide, or there are obstacles to provide services. So the discontent is driven by that. But in an electoral competition, as it is now, the votes are not moving by answer to the social discontents. The answer are usually in an electoral competition very broad, very jargoning, very not sharp when it comes to find solution to the daily lives of the people. So from an electoral perspective, it's easier to say, I want to close the border and moving 100K votes, rather than taking measure that, of course, when you take measure in terms of policies, take years and years and years for the implementation. So it means that in that electoral part, or in that moment, the person, the leader is at the government, maybe cannot in a second moment take the the praising for the measure, because there will be another leader in government. So it is very hard in an electoral competition because it cannot have an immediate effect on the perception of people, because a politician can say, yes, I improve, for example, the access to employment, but the result will be in 10 years. So in the meantime, a competitor can say, nothing changed. Why you are saying that you are changing things while nothing is actually moving here? And if you say like the result will be seen afterwards and so on, that's not going to work in an electoral competition in which what it's needed now is to be sharp, to be the strong man or the strong woman. I would say maybe now the strong man, since in politics there are not many women as leaders, and it's very, very hard to talk about these issues. So I would like also to have feedbacks from you on that. What's your struggle when you want to talk about this, the issues that involve your job and involve your personal life, because that would be very interesting for me to know in your political culture in your country how this is, how this actually works. So I would stop here at the moment, because I think I just gave a little bit of inputs, and I would rather, like receive questions or, to go on a certain direction based on your interest. So thank you so much.
Oh, it's wonderful. Thank you so much, and for setting that stage. Before I pass the baton to Sonja, just one small admin note, and I forgot to remind everybody that we are recording this meeting, so you've heard it from me, it's official. It's out there. And also, if you go to the top of the chat, you'll find the World Employment Confederation EU election manifesto link at the top, if any of you haven't read it. Also, we would like to turn this into a full discussion after Sonja's presentation. So please populate the chat with your questions, and I'll be able to moderate those as we move along. But now I'd like to pass it over to Sonja, because Eleonora, you really painted a clear picture of that hearts and minds is what captures during election. And really what we're proposing are solutions. So we have to work within those constraints. So Sonja, I leave it to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Eleonora, as well, for a great insight in what the European elections will be, and actually where the power of the member states lie when it comes to the outcome of the European elections. And while you were speaking, I was actually thinking that the last European elections took place in 2019, as you mentioned. But actually, Europe fundamentally changed after that. We experienced, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine. We had a Brexit in 2020. So Europe today is fundamentally different from 5 years ago in that sense. And that brings different challenges. At the same time, we still need a coalition of the willing in order to come to the Europe that we want and that we are looking for, and that we all need in order to thrive in life, basically on a citizenship level in that sense. Andrew already alerted to it. We launched the WEC-Europe manifesto with quite some good solutions, I would say, especially when it comes to labor market issues, because the World Employment Confederation Europe is all about labor market solutions in that sense. And although we are still experiencing quite some challenges in Europe, I mean, look at the inflation rate that is still ongoing, of course, and rising. Look at labor markets that are being dominated, for example, by talent scarcity combined with skills mismatch, a demographic change, which is, of course, driven by an aging society. The perma crisis state of mind that we are still in. So there are still a lot of challenges in Europe when we look at how to deal with this on a policy level. Having said that, coming to a sustainable solution that fosters economic growth and that allows for innovation on all sorts of levels, I mean, that's, I think, the way we want to go in order to create the future and the Europe that we want, and that we also need in order to create a future-proof labor market. You were talking about EU election legislation, but if we look at labor market legislation, most of the labor market legislation has not been updated since last century, 60s, 70s, 80s in that sense. That is already quite some time ago. So also for European labor markets to keep up to date with today's reality in order to become future-proof, we need to be able to get some modernization of the regulatory framework in order to allow for things like diverse forms of work, but also improved social protection systems in that sense, in order for everybody to be able to thrive in life, as I would say so. When we look at the Europe that is today, as Andrew put it nicely, we are now, when we look at labor markets across Europe, we are now looking at an average unemployment rate of 5.9%. We are looking at a participation rate of about 75%. We also see that full employment is a definition that is coming across in certain markets more and more. When we look at countries like, for example, Netherlands, Sweden, Belgium, Germany, but also Hungary and Czech Republic, we see that there is already the phase of full employment. And we talk about full employment when the labor market is experiencing participation rates of over 80% and an unemployment of lower than 3% in that sense. That means that it becomes quite difficult actually to look for ways to find solutions to fight talent scarcity combined with skills mismatch in that sense. If we take the overall European average of 5.9 unemployment rate and 75% participation rate, there are also some countries that are still above that. So Spain, Greece, for example, Spain with 12% unemployment rate, Greece with nearly 10% unemployment rate. There are still countries left in Europe where we still have to do a lot in order to get the right people back to the labor market. And with the right people, I mean that everybody is a talent, but there's also some groups that experience a little bit of a more distance towards the labor market and that need more support, coaching and guidance in order to get back to the labor market. This is exactly where our industry, where the members of the WEC-Europe can play a crucial and key role in order to facilitate that process, basically. Quite an important point for Europe is to come up with a new, actually, framework for a new social contract. So the last social contract dates back already from a century ago, where lifetime employment was still there. where people were looking at a retirement age of about, well, somewhere between 50 and 60 around that, where hybrid working and online working wasn't a fact yet. So the need for a new social contract is definitely there, especially after we have been able to establish the fact that Europe is not the Europe today as it was 5 years ago. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have found new ways of connecting, new ways of working, I should say. And this has definitely changed the world of work as we know it today. That is also why we are looking for more social protection schemes for everybody to make sure that we can meet the need for more security. Eleonora already mentioned it, like there's a lot of challenges going on in Europe. There's a lot of fear going on in Europe at this moment in time. And the need for some sort of solution that fuels back to security is definitely high within Europe at this moment in time. So the need for a new social protection system and a new social contract is definitely there, I should say. But we need to be able to combine this with flexibility, because diverse forms of work are definitely there, and they are here to stay. When we look at our industry, which in certain markets already dates over 60 years, it's an industry that is here to stay. We are contributing to economic growth, both on the member state level as well as on an European economic level. And in order to make sure that we can continue to play that role, we need to make sure that the regulatory framework is in place. Now, when we talk about agency work, for example, we have the European Agency Work Directive that is now in place for over 15 years. And when we look at the constraints, the elements, the framework of the Agency Work Directive that it's based upon, and we look at the elements that are in that framework, and we look at it objectively and neutrally, we can still say that the Agency Work Directive today, as it was implemented 15 years ago, is still fit for purpose. It is still focusing up on adequate social protection for our agency workers. It is still looking at things like equal pay and equal treatment, but it's also looking at how can we increase that contribution from our industry by lifting unjustified restriction and making sure that an appropriate balanced framework is there in that sense. Of course, there is much more to it. I already talked about it when we are talking about talent scarcity combined with the skills mismatch. Skills are the new currency when we are talking about labor market solutions. So the need for lifelong learning is definitely there. I always say we need to change lifetime employment into lifetime employability, making sure that you remain attractive throughout your career for the labor markets, not only today, not only tomorrow, but even the day after tomorrow. So making sure that as a person, you also remain future-proof. You can only do that when the right infrastructure is in place and when there are policies in place that allow you to improve your skills and competences, both on a national level as well as on a European level in that sense. Dealing with the skills mismatch, one vital skill that we all need to develop actually is, of course, the skills we need in a digital age in that sense. More and more we see that digitalization and technology are driving the world as we know it today. I always say we are one click away from what we are looking for at this moment in time, but it also means that we have to keep those skills up to date. That means that we also need to ensure that when it comes to digitalization and, for example, artificial intelligence, we have the proper safeguards in place. So an appropriate balanced regulatory framework that allows for a level playing field when it comes to all players, that allows for the right level of enforcement and compliance is definitely something that we have to be looking at when we are talking about the Europe that we want. We have to find that right balance that allows for economic growth and innovation, while at the same time providing that feeling of security for the European citizens, making sure that they are well on the way and that they are protected and secured from those players that are not following the law and the regulatory framework in that sense. I think there's a lot more to talk about, Andrew, but allow me to keep it at that by closing off that, of course, from an industry perspective, WEC-Europe has very good solutions in order to deal with these kind of challenges. We already named a few. I see that the chat is actually exploding with questions at this moment in time, but for our industry, for WEC-Europe, it is key to have a seat at the table, to be able to play a role in order to boost economic growth, to make sure that we are able to bring people back to the labor market, whether that is from studies to employment, whether that is from employment to employment, or whether that is from unemployment to employment, and last but not least, maybe sometimes even from retirement to employment. There are so many options that we can facilitate talent in order to get back to the world of work that I think the facts and figures speak for itself. In last year alone, we already provided 12.4 million people in Europe with work in that sense. 11.2 people were on an agency work contract on their way to even progress on the labor market, and 1.2 million people were already on a direct employment recruited within the labor market. So we can only boost this even more when we can take up that role that we actually are born to play, I would say. So Andrew, with this, I'll hand over back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sonja. This is a great intervention. And yes, you're right. The chat is exploding. So I'm going to jump into it right away. I'm going to go back to Eleonora quickly, just to sort of open up wider again before I dive into some of the WEC questions. Something I didn't mention off the top was this is a monumental year for national federal elections around the world. Billions of people are going to the polls. I'm just wondering, with the EU bloc being so significant and how many elections and the European Parliament Commission playing such a central role, how much will these elections perhaps influence other parts of the world who haven't yet headed to the polls? By the time we get to June, I look at the United States, but more looking at how can Europe be that example, keeping in mind that it's one thing that people do not like is change. But Sonja mentioned rebuilding and recreating that social contract is going to require that kind of change and people to have to step into the unknown, so to speak. So maybe if you could comment on that a little bit of how significant Europe is globally with these elections this year.
Thank you for the question. I think it's very interesting. I would rather say that Europe is considered as an example in terms of legislation rather than election. For example, we had the first regulation on artificial intelligence in the world, and any other regulation, for example, on the protection of data, or it's a kind of always, when I talk about not European living in not European countries, they really mention most of the time policy rather than the politics, which it seems to be more a domestic question inside member states and inside Europe. When it comes to, for example, media coverage of the European election, I think it's more a European focus rather than third countries focus. And for third countries, I mean not European countries, because I mean, outside Brussels, I have the perception, and that even like in some part of Europe, it's not really clear what the EU is. And the EU maybe is not communicating very well what the EU is. Sometimes it's compared with the WTO, for example, which is actually something different because, of course, it works completely in a different way. And politically speaking, I have the feeling that even the media attention, it's more driven, for example, in election in member states, like, for example, in France, in Spain, in Germany, and so on, rather than the European election, which there is a little bit of coverage in I mean global media, not European media, like for example, EurActiv. Of course, it is the main focus for us because we are European media based in Brussels following the EU. But when it comes to global media, I had the feeling that European elections do not make the lead so easily. That might change in the future, but it depends on, you know, like how the things change. It will change afterwards. I mean, we see many changes. What I think it's maybe there could be a bigger interest this time because of what we did in terms of legislation with the vaccine, with the AI Act, and with any other legislation that can be relevant for other third countries. I would rather say like European elections are not important as US election in terms of coverage. I mean, they will remain the main election for everyone because in terms of foreign policy or what the US does will remain very important. And another element I want to add, we do not have as European Union a foreign policy. That affects a lot the fact that it's maybe less interesting than national election. Like, of course, if there will be Macron or Marine Le Pen in France, and there will be, you know, the result of French election in the European election in France, maybe will be more relevant for a global media rather than the European election itself, of how the European Parliament will be composed. That's my personal opinion on this.
But you know, you make a really good point about the legislation and regulation, and Europe being seen as a leader in those areas. And Sonja, there's a good question here about looking at what efforts countries could promote or adapt to highlight cross-pollination innovation, basically having member states working together for common goals, common outcomes. Maybe looking from our industry standpoint, how could we aid in helping that happen and trying to promote that?
I think one of the best solutions that we've come up with is, for example, when we are talking about skilling policies in that sense. And then I'm looking specifically at the countries where we have, for example, a bipartite training fund. A bipartite training fund, for your information, is a training fund that is being set up by both the industry players, jointly shared by the trade unions that are our social partners on a national level. We have those bipartite training funds, for example, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, but also in Italy and other countries across Europe. And within those bipartite training funds, social partners, trade unions, employer representatives are discussing together what are the best possible solutions in order to provide our agency workers with training in order to equip them with the right skills that the labor market is looking for at this moment in time. Now, those bipartite training funds have been there for quite some time already, and I think they are a great success story of how social partners actually can work together for the benefit of workers in general on the national level. So yeah, that for me, Andrew, is one of the greatest examples when we are talking about cross-pollination innovation in that sense.
I just want to keep, maybe dive a little deeper into that. They are great examples of something that works, but yet it seems like there's not enough of them. And there's a good question in here from Michael about skilling, but specifically to youth. And we do see a gap there in the labor shortage from youth. How can the European Union promote these type of programs and target those demographics moving forward? Maybe Sonja first, and Eleonora, maybe if you have a comment on that as well. How do you engage youth in this?
Well, I mean, it's the European Year for Skills, which is definitely also looking at youth, of course. And I think one of the things that makes it so complicated is that the current curriculum of educational institutes are still very much focused on what was instead of what do we need in that sense. And from an industry perspective, I think we are there to play a role because we know better than anyone actually where the supply is, where the demand is, and why there is a mismatch in some cases. So we can definitely play a crucial role when we are talking about, okay, designing the curriculum for the educational institutes in order to equip youth with the right skills in that sense. Having said that, the other day I read an article and I found actually that 80% of the skills is learned via work. So work is essential for all people, youth included, to be able to equip themselves with the right skills for the labor market. 80% of the skills acquired via work in that sense. So that means that, again, there's a crucial role for our industry to play here, to make sure that we can equip everybody with the right skills via work, I would say.
Eleonora, what Sonja just said, there's a method to this. There is something we can do to engage the youth through their skilling. But when we look at the elections themselves, often we see low turnout for young voters. What can be done to boost that? And just maybe your thoughts on looking at these elections. I've heard that turnout is expected to be lower. Do people see this as a just foregone conclusion in what's going to happen, or are they disillusioned? And what can be done to bring them back?
So first of all, I just want to jump in what Sonja was saying before, just to underline that the European Union has very often limited competences in different subjects that are very crucial, in particular for you, like, for example, social issues or education. Like, the competences are only at national level, and we are in a period when, for example, there was a war in Ukraine, and we have to, or for example, we have to have a common response for the Reduction Act in the US. We need a European response rather than national response. And all the leaders, and I remember there was an article in the Financial Times on how France was coping very well with the inflation that there was after the war in Ukraine. And they said, like, at the end of the article, that the measure would be good until a certain period, and then they have to put other measure in place because the national content is totally limited. Think about if they do that at the European level. I think at the moment there is only not the interest at the governmental level to put that things and this measure at EU level, which is a great damage from my point of view for the European integration and European citizens that should benefit the good thing of being in a union of 27 member states in which can have a better response to crisis, inflation, social issues, and so on. About young voters, I think this is a good question to ask to European institutions like the European Parliament. I know that they did a plan to involve young voters, asking Taylor Swift or any other big important band to campaign to go to vote, which could be considered nice, though sometimes they invite influencers and or they invite famous people to do posts on Instagram, to be on social, which is a good strategy, like, as well, but I don't think it hit the core problem of going to vote in an election, which is like we need a democracy, that our democracy is in crisis, because when a democracy is not renewing all the time, we are, of course, in crisis because the society change and we have only the vote to express what we think, which is totally limited. We do not have a standardized form of deliberative democracy, participation. We have just few examples that are not hegemonic. So most of the time people feel that elections are not really close to their heart. In particular, young people that I would say as, kind of young people, politics, it's not really doing things for young people when it comes to policy, when it comes to narrative. It focuses on those that has to go to vote. So elder people that usually are more in Europe, and usually they always go to vote. So there is a problem of narrative of political level. There is a problem of democracy. So there is a problem of involvement of young people in democracy. And there is, let me say that, I'm sorry, there is a lot of hypocrisy from politicians to say, young people, we do have to learn something from young people, but this I really never seen someone involving young people in a real way in politics or in any other thing that can be relevant. Of course, it is based on my personal experience. Maybe you have examples of, good practice that can be shared.
Well, thanks for that. And certainly, as Taylor Swift is wanted everywhere, it seems, right now for elections, the WEC unfortunately cannot afford to bring her on. That would be quite a campaign. But I guess leading to that, Eleanor, you asked about the solutions. And one of the questions from Gustav, Sonja, was the challenges that we face in moving this manifesto and having it be seen and accepted. And I think this sort of ties into that. Again, looking at solution-based material here, content that we have to say we have the answers, but that's not necessarily how people are going to embrace messages politically. And how can we find a sweet spot there to get these messages across?
Well, it's one thing that we have a manifesto on a European level, which is great, and that we should be super proud of course, because it's content rich and it contains a lot of solutions, as you already pointed out, Andrew. It's another thing when you listen to Eleonora that actually this election campaign takes place on the national level, so on a member state level. So in order to take away the biggest obstacles, actually also to be able to translate what is happening on the European level back to the member state level, and to be able to translate the solutions from the manifesto to a member state level. We all have strong industry federations on the European level in that sense, and on the national level. So we can certainly drive forward that content-rich solutions that we have put available within the manifesto. When we look at Europe at this point in time, and Eleonora already alluded to that actually, there's a very divergent views on what is the right solution for Europe as a continent at this moment in time. Having said that, it's quite easy to say close the borders and put all the focus on protecting Europe and etc. and things like that. It actually takes willingness, and it takes leadership and responsibility in order to step up and to really go for the right solution to all these challenges in that sense. So diverging views, member state level involvement, they should all be taken into account when we are able to convey the messages of this manifesto, in my view.
You mentioned something, Sonja, that really resonates with the WEC right now, and it's very political. You mentioned closing borders, and that is migration. And just yesterday, the WEC submitted feedback on the European talent pool, looking at recruiting third-party nationals to come to Europe to work to fill those laboring skills gaps. And just wondering, when you look at something like that, that's a innovative solution. We have our criticisms of that, but the Commission making steps to try to solve this. But at the same time, politically, this is not a politically friendly issue whatsoever. I'm just wondering, how do you balance those? Maybe Sonja and Eleonora, if you could talk about that the Commission is, you have to move forward to solve these issues. But at the same time, it could be throwing gasoline on political flames. Just wondering your comments on that.
Well, it's a sensitive topic, let's be completely honest. At the same time, we are looking to move forward more and more to what is called a shortage economy. So that means increasing consumption patterns. Well, production patterns are actually decreasing at this moment in time. And that's the result of demographic change, aging society, talent scarcity combined with skills mismatch. So in order for all that, a solution, not the solution, but a solution is definitely to tap into to knowledge migrants, economic migrants. The European talent pool as set up. Yes, we have some criticism on that, but mostly what we are calling for here on this specific dossier is actually for our industry to be able to play a key role here, because again, as said, we know where the demand is, we know where the supply is, and in order to make sure that we can realize that great match, it would be good to be able to collaborate with not only the European institutions, but also the institutions on a national level when the European talent pool is being implemented and rolled out on the national level in that sense. So definitely we are looking for a way to be able to collaborate, to put into practice our knowledge and expertise, but also data in order to make sure that we can move forward to realizing that best match between demand and supply. Thanks, Andrew.
Eleonora, do you want to comment on that, please?
Yes, I would like to stress that there is an important contradiction between two different rhetorics on migration. So there is the bad migration, like we have to tie the borders, we have to close, even though there are pushbacks, abuse on human rights, and you know, like it's a very spread rhetoric that you know, I remember von der Leyen said that you know, we have to shield Europe against migrants. That was at the beginning of her mandate. It was not even pandemic yet. So there is this idea that it's important for Europe to tie the border. On the other hand, there is a problem of shortage, and there is this idea of legal migration, of regular migration, sorry, and on that we have to create this match, that we need them. And these are not going very well together, because if you have to tie the border, and it means that we don't need them, you know, like in the head of the people, that's gonna crash a little bit. I read that about that there are yes, it's good that Europe can facilitate the connection between employer and employees abroad, because in the also, I mean, in the obstacle parts, like for example, if there is any languages obstacles, information of visas, knowledge on, you know, like these kind of things, I think it will be a good work from the EU side to help companies to you know, cut the obstacles when it comes for example, in terms of the language. Like for example, in Hungary, if they need a specific skill, but you know, the person or doesn't speak Hungarian, or you know, it doesn't have access on how to get a house in Hungary, it could be a problem because the person cannot be recruited. So I think like the Europe can play a role in that, but it's also very problematic from my point of view, having this rhetoric of we need migrants, as like we want migrants as long as they can fit in our labor market. Otherwise, they don't have right to stay. I think this is very detrimental from a perspective of human beings, you know, like because there are some people have more rights than others of movements. And that could be problematic in the long term when these two narratives will crash and crash again and again, even in episodes like, or in, you know, national legislation done for electoral purposes, but then you need the migrants, but then you need the permits, but you don't want to give the permits. And that's going to be a problem, I think.
Sonja, any other comment on that? It's really a minefield of challenges in that regard. And I'm just wondering too, Eleonora, there's a lot of rhetoric in any election. How much of this do you anticipate may calm and cooler heads prevail and actually look to these solutions once those ballots are cast in June?
You mean the composition of the European Parliament?
No, more of these hot topics. Hot topics help people get elected, but once they have to govern and actually legislate, then that WEC manifesto comes out and goes, oh, look, an actual solution to a problem, depending on how that composition is. But do you see, you know, we'll get over the rhetoric, we'll get through this period of electioneering and then get back into the business of running the European Union. Do you see that happening, or are we on the precipice of great change and uncertainty?
Well, I think like there are some MEPs that I have met that are very committed in the legislation, and that's an element that there is, and it will remain. Then usually there are, you know, the one excluded by the legislation, like for example, non-attachment, that they do not have legislative files in the hand. This is very important. Just a brief parenthesis. If you are a political group, the bigger political group you are, the most probability you have to be elected as a vice president or another internal body thing or rapporteur. So you manage a legislative file and you will negotiate, or chair of a committee. And of course, the SNDs, so the Socialists and the European People Party, MEPs, they have more probability to have these roles because they are the bigger one. So this is very important when it comes to legislation. In this parliament, usually it's in the hands of the socialists, of the EPP, and then the third party, which is Renew Europe, which are the liberals. What it can change the next legislation is to see whether the ECR, so the European Conservative and Reformist groups at the European Parliament, will have the same shape as it is now, will probably be the third larger party in the European Parliament, so we'll have more roles. So we'll have more legislation. How they will behave, they will continue to be on social media, most of them, or they will start to be more and more establishment. In Italy, for example, Meloni showed to be establishment, and she changed the narrative and she become more a governmental person in comparison to before. This is an evolution of different far-right parties. So it's the true for Meloni, but I think it's the same for other parties. And I think we can see that evolution, and we will keep seeing other MEPs not going to the plenary session and talking bad about Europe because it's very good for their likes on social media.
Sonja, we touched on this a little bit, but the labor market has changed a great deal in the past couple of years. A lot has gone on. And we do see that outside of Europe as well, governments tend to be a little slower in catching up to those trends, those changes. Just wondering from your perspective, the perspective of our industry, how important is it that our private staffing industry has a greater voice in guiding where the future of work, where work is, where it is going, to help maybe legislation catch up to the reality?
I think it's really vital and if not to say crucial to put it mildly, Andrew, because of the simple matter of the fact that new forms of work are, have already been popping up since last century. Agency work, open fixed-term contracts, part-time contracts, all alongside open-ended contracts, permanent contracts in that sense. We are now looking at new varieties of self-employment, online platform work, things like that. So yeah, I would say that for a player like WEC-Europe, it's crucial to have a seat at the table in order to be able to co-design together with our social partners, together with governmental institutions, to be able to have a say in what the future world of work should be looking like. And I'm specifically mentioning social partners here. And also trade unions in that sense, because I truly don't believe that we can organize this or orchestrate this without them in that sense. I was looking at your previous question to Eleonora, and I was thinking that the next 5 years will actually be very transformative in Europe, because there are a lot of dossiers on the table which have been there for a long time and which now require some sort of a solution. And when it comes to the world of work, when it comes to the labor markets, I think that from a private employment agency perspective, we have some great input that we can bring to the table. We have some great best practice examples that we can bring to the table, not only on a national level, but also on a European level, I would say. So moving forward, things will only going to evolve more, meaning that the whole digitalization and technologization that has already transformed the world of work during the past couple of years will continue to transform the world of work in the next years to come. We are looking again at talent scarcity in a way to solve this in the right way. Yes, legal migration, as said, is one of the solutions. But for examples, co-working, where human and robot teams are working alongside together, is another solution, for example. Changing social protection schemes definitely is also one of the solutions. So I think we have multiple solutions that we can bring to the table in order to allow for our industry to play a key role here. And as said already earlier in this presentation, when we are talking about allowing a key role to play, we are focusing up on contributing to economic growth all levels. That's on national level, that's on European level, I would say. And in order to be able to do that, yeah, we need to be able to engage with the right stakeholders, being, of course, the political institutions, but also the educational institutions, trade unions. We can, of course, come up with much more stakeholders than only these. But having a seat at that table and be able to co-design what the future of world of work should look like and what the future world of work we want. Yeah, I think it's crucial in order to move forward, definitely.
With that, I'm going to segue to one last question before I leave it to your final thoughts to wrap up. And this comes from Menno. It's a very good question. Eleonora, I'll give this to you first from your perspective. If the parliament moves more socially conservative, do you expect it to become easier or harder for them to form majorities in parliament on social affairs dossiers?
That's a very interesting question. One thing to mention from my perspective, nowadays, we don't really have right wing and left wing anymore. We have more a broad spectrum of conservatives. So that means that the policy pursued by some political party cannot be so identical to what they actually was born for. So, for example, I take the example of Giorgia Meloni's party, Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, because I studied his evolution since the beginning. And before it was anti-EU, it was wanted the exit to the EU. It was completely, impossible to have a government. But then she evolved, and now all the centrist and conservative parties are starting to say that they want to stay in the EU, they want to keep this EU as long as national countries have a great power. So I expect that if the ECR will be the third group at the European Parliament, there could be an evolution, which doesn't mean there will be, kind of new socialists, but maybe there will be a little bit more liberals in some decision based on how they have to find compromise in the legislation. Another thing, I'm quite sure that the social policy will be more in rapporteurs of the Socialists and the European People Party rather than, for example, ECR that, for example, will show interest for other legislative files that they can, campaign more, since ECR, it's not really this social campaigner on social issue. I think maybe we'll manage files more on identity or more on, human trafficking or migration, or these are the files that maybe they are interested more in comparison with social issues. And I expect a further evolution of parties in the conservative groups and also the evolution of the groups itself, because there will be a reshuffle. Let's be clear on that. Thank you.
All right, with time ticking away, Sonja, I'll give you a final thought, just where the industry, where we go from here with elections just a few months down the road.
Well, I think if anything, this conversation has made clear, we need to focus upon rebuilding trust within Europe in that sense, with all relevant stakeholders to play a role, of course, here. It's, for me, about getting that right, appropriate, balanced regulatory framework in place, but also enforcement and compliance is key here in order to make sure that we are able to walk the talk. So yeah, definitely looking ahead of the next couple of months with great interest. I think there are a lot of dossiers on the table, from the European talent pool actually to the European Agency Work Directive, to renewing social protection schemes, skills policies that definitely will have that will be on the agenda in that sense, and where we are able to provide great input from our industry. I already saw a question: how can we translate this manifesto back to the national level? I think that's a great example of how people actually are waiting for this kind of information that we have made available via the WEC-Europe manifesto, in order to fuel back into the national markets, because most of the labor markets in Europe are dealing with the same issues. Again, talent scarcity, skills mismatch, how to look for the right people in that sense, aging society, of course. So definitely, I think that WEC Europe is well equipped, as well as can play a key role in order to come up with the right solutions to definitely create that Europe that we all want, which is, of course, that we all want to thrive in life in that sense. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, Andrew. Thank you.
Perfect. That's excellent way to wrap up with 1 minute left. And just, I'll go right back to the beginning. I know it was another question from Michael, but we mentioned Jacques Delors off the top. So hopefully, our hope is the next crop of politicians have is much or more of a proactive EU agenda moving forward as he did so long ago. And before I leave everyone, a little shameless plug for the next WEConversations coming up on the 29th of February. It's a leap year, so you cannot forget this one. But we're going to be delving into AI in the HR industry, friend or foe, walking the risk and opportunity high wire of AI in our industry. So please make sure you mark that in your calendars and come up for that one. And again, thank you so much, Sonja, Eleonora, for joining us today. A wonderful conversation. And for all of our guests, thank you for being here with us. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.